The iron gates of Ashveil Park emerged from the freezing fog of January 1814 as though the mist itself had laboured to produce them, tall, black and silent, their scrolled finials dripping with the slow persistence of a cold that had settled into the county some weeks before and showed no inclination to depart. The lane beyond was a pale wound through bare-armed oaks, and the carriage that passed beneath those gates moved with the hesitant dignity of something that understood it was trespassing upon a grief far older than the season. The horses breathed in great visible clouds, and the wheels turned with that particular muffled complaint that frozen ruts exact from iron and wood alike, and still the house at the end of the avenue refused to reveal itself all at once, offering instead only gradual intimations, a chimney stack here, a dark cornice there, as though Ashveil Park were a story that must be approached with patience, or not approached at all. When it came fully into view, it was as large as the rumours had suggested, and as forbidding as the silences between those rumours had implied. A wide Palladian face of pale stone gone grey, with the particular greyness that English winters confer upon everything they touch long enough. The marble steps that rose to the front door were cracked along the third riser in a manner that had been cracked, one suspected, for many years. A wound the house refused to heal, as though mourning required some outward and visible sign that no mason had been permitted to efface. The columns on either side stood in their proper grandeur, but the ivy that climbed between them had been allowed to thicken past elegance into something closer to enclosure, and the general impression the house conveyed was of a handsome face that had ceased to attend to itself, not from neglect precisely, but from the deeper inattention of those who have lost the person for whom the looking-glass once mattered. Into this atmosphere, as the carriage drew to a stop on the gravelled sweep before those steps, there descended Miss Eleanor Voss, 26 years of age, plain in the manner that is often called sensible by those who mean to be kind, and overlooked by those who do not, and composed in the manner of a woman who has learned that composure is the one elegant thing available to her at no expense. She wore a travelling cloak of dark wool, well brushed, but long acquainted with use, and she carried a worn leather case of modest dimensions, the sum of what a woman in her particular position could afford to call her own after a life spent making herself useful in houses that belonged to others. She did not hesitate upon the step. She looked up at Ashveil Park with the quiet attention she gave to most things, which was thorough and unhurried, and she observed the cracked marble and the encroaching ivy, and the broad grey silence of the place without visible alarm, for she had come to serve the ailing dowager Countess Calder, and she had understood from the letter of engagement that this was not a house in which happiness had recently been a resident. There was, however, one exception to the general extinction of warmth that the house presented to the January afternoon. High in the east wing, where the stone rose above the roof-line of the lower service range in a manner that suggested rooms of considerable isolation, a single window held light, not the bright, indifferent light of a room well attended, but the amber and uncertain light of candles that have been burning long enough to become an act of will rather than convenience. A small and specific warmth set against the grey expanse of the facade as deliberately as a word spoken very quietly in a room where everyone else has fallen silent. Eleanor noticed it in the way one notices the single sound that persists after all others cease. She had looked away and looked back, and it was then, in the interval of that second looking, that a shadow passed behind the glass, a shape that might have been a figure standing close to the pane, or might have been the movement of a curtain, caught by some interior draught, or might have been nothing at all that the eye could be trusted to confirm. It was gone before she could be certain. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pelham, had appeared at the door above the cracked marble step, her expression arranged in the particular welcome of those who have learned to receive strangers with correctness rather than warmth, and Eleanor turned toward her, with her worn leather case and her composed face and the quiet that she carried with her always, and walked up into the house that held its breath around her, like a cold that had not yet decided whether to relent. The morning room at Ashveil Park smelled of dried lavender and something older, beeswax and faded silk, and the particular stillness that gathers in rooms where little has changed for many years. A fire had been lit in Eleanor's honour, yet it gave more smoke than warmth, and the pale winter light that pressed against the tall windows seemed almost to apologise for its own insufficiency. Lady Marin, the dowager Countess of Ashveil, received her new companion from the depths of a chaise longue draped in sable fur, her small figure so deeply nested among the cushions that only her face and her hands were entirely visible, hands that rested, folded, and still, upon the fur as though they had long since made their peace with idleness. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older, and her eyes, which were the pale, clear grey of January sky, moved over Eleanor with a precision that polished conversation had not yet had occasion to blunt. Eleanor curtsied, and offered the words one offers in such circumstances, and Lady Marin received them without particular enthusiasm, her gaze dropping, only once, and without haste, to Eleanor's gloves. The gloves were wool, carefully mended at the left forefinger, and the mending was neat work, honest work, the kind that announces its own necessity without shame. Lady Marin said nothing of the gloves. She said, instead, that she hoped Eleanor did not mind draughts, as Ashveil Park had several that Mrs. Pelham had given up attempting to address, and that she herself found the cold clarifying in small doses, though her physician held a differing view. There was a dry precision to the observation, a humour so composed it might easily have been mistaken for complaint, and Eleanor, who had learned in previous employments to read the gap between what is said and what is meant, understood that she was being assessed, and that the assessment had not yet reached its verdict. Mrs. Pelham arrived promptly to escort Eleanor to her room. The housekeeper was a compact, careful woman, with keys at her waist and an expression of permanent, mild vigilance, as though the house itself were a charge she had undertaken to protect from the carelessness of others. She led Eleanor up a back stair and along a corridor, where the wainscoting was dark with age and the portraits were landscapes rather than persons. An unusual choice, Eleanor thought, for a family of some standing. The room assigned to her was on the second story, its window looking out upon the kitchen garden, its chimney drawing poorly, so that a thin thread of smoke curled back into the room, and lent the air a faint autumnal quality at odds with the January cold. The shutter to the left of the window hung at a gentle angle, not quite seated in its frame, admitting a whisper of wind that stirred the curtain at irregular intervals through the evening. Eleanor unpacked her trunk with quiet efficiency, hanging her 2 good dresses and setting her books upon the narrow shelf above the writing table, and if she felt the particular loneliness of a new place, its unfamiliar sounds, its silences that are not yet one's own, she kept that feeling, as she had learned to keep most feelings, in the orderly interior where it could trouble no one. Dinner was laid in a small dining room 1 floor below, a room plainly intended for more than 2, but arranged that evening to accommodate only herself and Lady Marin. The long table had been half shrouded in a cloth as though the unused portion were in gentle mourning, and 2 places were set near the head, Eleanor's and the dowager's, with a 3rd arrangement of silver and crystal standing at the far end, before the empty chair that sat with the particular stillness of a chair, awaiting an occupant who is expected but does not come. A footman, young and fair-haired, and possessed of that anxious quality that bespoke recent appointment, removed that 3rd setting midway through the soup course, folding the cloth with precise unhurried motions, while Lady Marin discussed the comparative merits of 2 varieties of autumn apple with perfect composure, as though the removal were unremarkable, as though empty chairs were a natural feature of the landscape here. Eleanor ate what was set before her, and replied when spoken to, and asked nothing of the vacant place. Later, in the room with the smoking chimney and the crooked shutter, she lay in the unfamiliar dark and listened to the house settle around her, its beams contracting in the cold, the distant groan of a shutter somewhere above, the wind moving along the gutters with patient indifference. Then, beneath all of that, something else. A footstep in the corridor beyond her door, measured and deliberate, pacing without haste before growing quieter and then ceasing altogether. Eleanor did not rise. She lay quite still, her breathing unhurried, her hands resting open upon the coverlet, and she listened to the silence that followed until the silence became the night itself. The frost had crept, in the manner of old griefs, along the lower panes of Lady Marin's sitting-room window, etching its pale lacework across the glass, as though the season itself wished to observe what passed within. And Eleanor Voss sat beside that window in the particular stillness that long habit had made second nature to her. A slender volume of Mr. Cowper's verse open across her lap, her voice low and even and unhurried in the way that Lady Marin preferred, neither theatrical nor colourless, but something in between, a quality the old woman had remarked upon only once, and in the dry tone she applied to most things she valued. The single brace of candles on the table beside them threw a circle of amber warmth across the page, and Eleanor read by that warmth, her eyes moving steadily along the lines while the fire behind the iron grate settled into itself with soft, percussive murmurs, and the house beyond the closed door maintained the particular quality of silence that belonged to Ashveil Park alone. Not the silence of emptiness, which is merely the absence of sound, but the silence of a place that holds its breath and knows something and does not speak. She had grown accustomed to that silence in the 3 days since her arrival, had learned already to distinguish the settling of old timbers from the quieter sound of a step on the flagged corridor, had noted without remarking upon it that certain hours of the evening brought a different texture to the air, a faint tension, as though something large and unresolved moved through the rooms just beyond the reach of candlelight. Lady Marin sat in her chair, with her shawl across her knees and her eyes half closed, and Eleanor could not always be certain whether the old woman listened or merely rested within the rhythm of the verse. But it did not matter, for that too was understood between them without words. She had reached the 3rd poem in the collection, those gentle lines in which the poet addresses winter with the tenderness one might extend to an old and difficult friend, when the quality of the room changed. It was not a sound that announced it, or not precisely, perhaps the faintest displacement of air from the direction of the door, perhaps some subtler thing that Eleanor could not afterwards name. But she became aware, with a certainty that arrived before any visual confirmation, that the room was no longer as it had been, that something had altered in the arrangement of the space around her, and she lifted her eyes from the page with the measured calm that was her particular form of composure, though her heart had contracted very quietly in her chest. He stood in the doorway. She had not seen him approach, had not heard the door open, and yet there he was, a tall figure in a dark coat of good wool, his frame filling the threshold with an economy that suggested neither threat nor welcome, but simply presence, as a stone standing in a field suggests neither, and his face was arranged in the careful blankness of a man who has schooled his expression to reveal as little as possible for so long that the arrangement has become permanent, the way a river will eventually carve the shape of its own course into the bedrock. He was perhaps 35 years of age, with the particular leanness of a man who forgets to eat when thought consumes him, and his dark eyes moved from the candles to the volume in Eleanor's lap, to her face, and rested there with an attention that was brief and very still as the house itself, as still as the frost on the lower panes. Lady Maren did not turn her head. The old woman's voice, when it came, was dry as October leaves, and equally unhurried, carrying the faint arch that Eleanor had already come to recognise as the closest Lady Maren permitted herself to open humour. "You may greet Miss Voss, Edmund," she said, "or you may leave. Both are equally acceptable." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between strangers are uncomfortable, but was instead a silence with a particular weight to it. The weight of something familiar being observed by someone new, and Eleanor held the page open and did not look away, because to look away would have been its own statement, and she did not wish to make any statement at all. He met her gaze. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, those dark eyes remained on hers with an expression she could not decipher, not cold, not warm, not curious, not indifferent, but something that existed in the narrow country between all of these, something she thought she might have called grief, had she known him better, had she any right to name what she saw. Then he turned, without a word, without a nod, without the smallest acknowledgement that Lady Maren had spoken, or that Eleanor existed in any permanent sense, and the doorway held only air, and the corridor beyond held only the old house's silence, and Eleanor lowered her eyes to the page and found, after a moment, the line where she had left off. The grey light that filtered through the narrow casement of Eleanor Voss's chamber at Ashveil Park arrived before any sound did, before the distant clatter of a grate being cleared below stairs, before the first tentative note of a thrush in the bare linden beyond the kitchen garden, before the house itself had gathered the resolve to be inhabited again. It was that particular pale light of an English winter morning, neither silver nor white, but something humbler than either, the colour of old linen left too long in a chest, and it lay across the floorboards in a single cold stripe, illuminating quite precisely, and without apparent ceremony, the small folded square of paper that rested against the base of the door. Eleanor saw it the moment she turned from the window. She did not move at once. She had learned, in the weeks since her arrival, that Ashveil Park rewarded stillness, that the house communicated its intentions in pauses rather than proclamations, in the creak of a settling beam, in the particular quality of silence that gathered on a landing after a door had been drawn shut. She rose, drew her shawl about her shoulders, and crossed the cold floor in her stockings, the boards faintly exhaling beneath her weight. The note had been slid with care, not thrust. There was a deliberateness to its placement that a careless hand could not have achieved. She took it up and unfolded it standing, for there was light enough now just to read by the grey stripe from the casement. The hand was spare, and masculine, each letter formed with an economy that suggested a man who wrote frequently and valued no word that could be dispensed with. There were few enough of them. She was requested, the note informed her, to avoid the east corridor between the hours of dusk and 9 o'clock in the evening. No reason was supplied. No reason, she suspected, was intended to be supplied. What drew her eye longest, after she had read the short sentence twice, was the absence of a signature. At the base of the note there was only a circle of dark wax, pressed firmly into the paper, bearing no impression, not a signet, not a crest, not the faintest ghost of a ring. A seal made anonymous by the deliberate withholding of a ring. It was, she thought, the act of a man who wished to be obeyed without being known, or perhaps of one who understood that to sign his name would transform a request into something else entirely, something with weight and implication and the uncomfortable nearness of an acknowledgment. Eleanor refolded the note along its original creases. She crossed to the small writing case of worn, brown leather that she kept on the shelf above the washstand, a case that had accompanied her through 2 prior positions and 1 difficult removal, that had absorbed the ink of letters she had never sent and the pressed petals of flowers she had carried from her mother's garden, and she placed the note inside it, beneath the stitched lining, where a small pocket had been sewn with her own hand for the keeping of private things. She dressed without hurry. She said nothing of the note at breakfast, neither to Lady Maren, who sat absorbed in a letter from her daughter in Bath, nor to Mrs. Pelham, who moved about the sideboard with the quiet authority of a woman who considered every object in the room to be, in some essential sense, her own. The day proceeded as days at Ashveil Park proceeded, without event, without warmth, without the specific comfort of being noticed. The afternoon faded early, as it did in December, the light withdrawing from the long windows of the drawing-room like a guest who has grown uncertain of his welcome, and by 4:30 the candles had been lit, and the east wing of the house had retreated into its accustomed obscurity. At 8:30, Eleanor took a single candle from the hall table. She did not tell herself that she was doing anything particular. She simply walked, as she sometimes walked in the evenings when Lady Maren had retired and the house had settled into its nighttime arrangements. The candle held at the level of her waist, its small flame steady in the windless interior air. She turned at the junction of the upper corridor toward the east. The east corridor was long and unlit and smelled of cold stone and something older, cedar perhaps, or the dried herbs that had once been hung in the linen closet at its far end. The floorboards here were darker, the walls unpapered, the plasterwork plain. Her candle threw a circle of amber that moved with her, illuminating a door handle, a framed engraving of a horse, a tarnished bracket, where a sconce had once been mounted and removed. She walked to the corridor's end and stood there a moment. She turned and walked back. There was no one. The corridor was entirely and perfectly empty, as though it had never contained anything more animate than the cold itself, which sat here with the settled patience of something that had long since ceased to expect company. The smell reached her before the door was fully open, beeswax and cold stone, and something older beneath both. The particular silence of a room that had held many winters and remembered each one without complaint. Eleanor stood at the threshold of the East Library with her hand still upon the latch, the forgotten shawl she had come seeking already irrelevant, for what lay before her was not the dim passage she had expected, but a long, low chamber lined on 3 sides with volumes whose spines had faded to the colour of dried lavender and autumn bracken. and at the centre of it, beneath a single branch of candles whose light fell golden and without mercy upon the table beneath, sat Edmund Calder, Earl of Ashveil, with a large map unrolled before him, and one hand resting at its edge to keep the corners from curling back into their preferred dark. He did not startle, he did not look up immediately, and when he did, it was with the measured attention of a man who had long since made his peace with being discovered in solitude, as though solitude were a country he inhabited openly and without apology. Eleanor did not speak. The cold of the corridor pressed at her back, and the warmth of the library's single hearth pressed gently at her face, and she was caught between them in a manner that seemed, in that suspended instant, rather a precise description of her position in the whole of Ashveil Park. He moved then, not to rise, not to bid her leave, but to shift the chair beside him, the one nearest the table's corner, a degree outward, a quiet and wordless alteration of the room's arrangement that was not quite an invitation and not quite anything else, only a small fact she was left to interpret as she chose. She chose to enter. The map, she saw as she drew near, was old, the paper soft with handling, the ink lines describing a county she did not immediately recognise, the hills rendered in the old manner, with small repeated marks like sleeping caterpillars ranged along the ridges. She asked, because silence between two people standing over a map is a more peculiar thing than speech, what county it depicted, and he told her it was Derbyshire, the northern portion, the parishes above the river. He did not say whose county it had been before it became only a map, and she did not ask, though she had heard enough from Mrs. Pelham in the ordinary run of household mornings to understand that the late countess had come from the north, from a family with land above some river or other, from a place that was cold in a different manner than Ashveil was cold, open cold, hill cold, the kind that did not seep through the stone but came at one directly across wide ground. The candles shifted in some draught she could not locate. His hand moved along the map's surface once, not pointing to anything particular, but following an old road that wound between two of the sleeping hills, and she watched his fingers and then looked away and saw, at the table's edge where his right hand rested, a thin silver band, lying flat against the wood. It was not on his finger. It was not in his pocket. It lay there in the candlelight as a thing that had been set down and not yet decided upon, and Eleanor understood without being told, and without looking at it a second time, that some objects occupy a space that is neither kept nor relinquished, and that a wise woman does not remark upon them. They spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour about the map, about the accuracy of such surveys, about whether hills were ever truly rendered faithfully by any cartographer, about the way a printed road never quite prepared one for the actual mud of it. He spoke in complete sentences and listened when she answered, which was not nothing, at Ashveil Park or anywhere else in 1814. When she at last remembered the shawl and mentioned it, he said that the housekeeper would know where such things went, which was true, and she agreed. And that was the end of it. She curtsied. He inclined his head. She withdrew with the shawl still unfound, and the cold of the east corridor closing around her again like water closing over a stone. But the smell of beeswax went with her, caught in the wool of her sleeve, and she carried it up the stairs to her room without noticing until she sat at the small writing table near her window and found that the night outside was clear for once, and the stars above the park were very numerous, and she was not, in this particular moment, unhappy. The afternoon light had turned the colour of old tallow when the wheels of an unannounced carriage sounded on the gravel sweep of Ashveil Park, and the house which had held its breath for weeks in the careful silence that grief imposes, seemed to draw itself tighter, as a person will upon hearing a noise they had hoped not to hear. Eleanor was crossing the upper landing with a volume of botanical correspondence she had been cataloguing for Lady Marin when the front doors opened below and admitted, along with a gust of January air, sharp enough to extinguish candles at 20 paces, Mr. Gerald Calder, and the full, ungovernable weight of his arrival. He came in boots, still carrying the mud of the road, trailing it across the stone flags in a manner that suggested he considered the stone flags fortunate for the distinction, and his voice preceded him up the staircase like a herald who had not been briefed on the household's customs of quietude. Eleanor paused at the banister. She did not lean over it. That would have been conspicuous, but she slowed her step and allowed herself to hear what the half-open morning-room door, directly beneath her, released into the stairwell without apology. Gerald Calder was Edmund's cousin by his father's line, she would later learn, a fact that appeared to grant him, in his own estimation, a proprietary interest in Ashveil's difficulties. He spoke of those difficulties with the ease of a man who has rehearsed his subject on a long journey, and is at last relieved to deliver it to its intended audience. Ashveil's debts, he said, were not inconsiderable. The late management of the estate accounts had left certain obligations outstanding, and there was, he continued, with the particular cheerfulness of one proposing a solution he finds entirely sensible, a young woman, a Miss Holt of Shropshire, well connected, in possession of a substantial portion settled in her own right, who had expressed, through the appropriate channels, a willingness to be introduced to a widower of Edmund's standing. The words arrived at Eleanor through the gap in the door as water finds its way through the stone, finding every small opening, settling in every small hollow. She did not move. The botanical volume remained against her arm, its cover pressing a faint rectangle into the fabric of her sleeve, and she stood in the particular stillness of someone who has understood something that they will not be permitted to respond to. She heard Edmund say very little. What she heard was the quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man who has been in this conversation before, and has learned that it finishes sooner if he does not feed it. Dinner that evening was laid with the full silver, as it always was when the household entertained. Mrs. Pelham did not reduce the ceremony for anyone, and the candelabra threw their usual warm, unsteady light across the long cloth and the arrangement of dried winter roses that Lady Marin had insisted upon since October. Eleanor sat in her customary place at the lower portion of the table, between a vacant chair and the reach of the nearest candle, which was close enough to read by if one angled one's page, though she read nothing that night. Gerald Calder sat opposite the Earl and spoke at intervals that suggested he had partitioned the meal into territories of talk and silence, and had assigned himself the greater portion. He was not an unkind man, Eleanor thought. He was something more difficult than unkind, being a man who was practical about people, who looked at a room and assessed it for its uses and its liabilities with the brisk, efficient gaze of someone accustomed to making calculations that involved other people's futures without consulting them. That gaze found Eleanor once, somewhere between the soup and the removal of the fish course, and it settled on her for the duration of a single measured breath, long enough to note the grey dress, the quiet hands, the absence of jewellery, the presence of a function. And then it slid away, complete in its assessment, thorough in its indifference, and she understood that she had been categorized in the space of that one breath as something that required no further accounting for. It was Lady Marin who brought Eleanor back to the present moment, and she did it without a word. The dowager's hand, dry and deliberate, reached beneath the level of the tablecloth and closed around Eleanor's wrist, not gently, not with the softness of comfort, but with the firm, unhurried pressure of someone transmitting intelligence. Eleanor did not look at her. Lady Maren did not look at her. The candles continued to burn. The conversation at the table's head continued its negotiation between Gerald's proposals and Edmund's silences, and beneath the white cloth the older woman's fingers said, with perfect clarity, what no one at Ashveil was yet prepared to say aloud, that something had entered the house with the mud of the road, and that Eleanor would do well to understand the nature of it before it understood the nature of her. The kitchen garden at Ashveil Park held its breath in the pewter hour before full morning, the air so still and cold that every exhaled cloud hung a moment like a small ghost before the frost dissolved it. Eleanor Voss had risen early, as was her custom, wrapping her grey wool cloak twice about her shoulders and carrying a small basket into the walled enclosure where the dormant beds lay, silver-edged and rigid, with the particular severity of a January that had refused, these 3 weeks past, to soften, even by a single degree. She was cutting rosemary, the woody stems half frozen and resistant against the small blade of her penknife, because Lady Maren took a tisane each morning that required it, and because the act of cutting, of pressing her thumb against something real and resinous and cold, steadied her in a way that the warm rooms of the house, with their watchful portraits and their carpeted silences, did not. The rosemary released its oil as she worked, sharp and green and incongruous against the dead season, the scent rising between her cold fingers like a quiet insistence that living things persisted beneath the surface of the world, even when no evidence of them was visible. She had been at the task perhaps 10 minutes, her basket barely half filled, when she became aware of footsteps on the gravel path, measured, unhurried, belonging to someone who had not come to the garden by accident. Edmund Calder, Earl of Ashveil, wore no greatcoat, only the dark wool of his morning coat, and the cold seemed not to find him. Or perhaps he had long ago reached a state of interior stillness so complete that exterior temperature had ceased to matter to him. He stopped perhaps 4 feet from her, his hands at his sides, and for a moment he simply regarded the bed she was working over, as though the frozen rosemary were of genuine botanical interest to him. Then, without the preamble of ordinary social mechanics, without the good morning, the remark on the weather, the courteous approach that politeness required, he said, plainly and quietly, whether she had formed any plans for the fortnight following the conclusion of her engagement with Lady Maren. Eleanor set her penknife deliberately against her palm and looked at him. She had not, she said. She had expected, when the contract expired, to return to Bath, where a former pupil's mother had made vague noises about a possible position that had not yet resolved itself into an offer. He received this without expression. He said then that he wondered whether she would consider remaining at Ashveil Park in her present capacity or such variation of it as she found suitable, and he named the terms without ornamentation, £80 the year, the rooms she currently occupied, and whatever time away from the household she required, within reason. £80 the year was, she knew without requiring a moment to calculate, more than twice the sum that Lady Maren paid her. It was a competence. It was the difference between a woman who was dependent upon the timely materialization of uncertain offers and a woman who possessed, if not independence, at least its first foundation stone. She did not say any of this. She looked at him, and he looked at the rosemary bed, and the only sound between them was the particular dry grind of frost-hardened gravel beneath their respective boots as the cold shifted them, minutely, without their willing it. There was, in the offer, no softness, and no ulterior warmth, nothing she could point to as sentiment or interest, or the beginning of anything that Gerald's scheme-minded conversation at dinner had implied the world was watching for. There was only the plainness of it. He needed a capable person to remain in the house, and she was capable, and the house needed her in ways that perhaps he himself could not enumerate aloud. The rosemary was cold and resinous in her basket, and the morning was the colour of pewter plate, and the frost lay over the parsley bed to her left in a crust that would not lift until noon, if then. She told him that she would consider it. Something passed across his face, not relief precisely, and not pleasure, but perhaps the faint relaxation of a man who had expected to be told no, and had been told something that was not yet no. He inclined his head once, a small formal inclination that belonged entirely to the century they inhabited, and he turned and walked back along the gravel path toward the house, his coat dark against the pale morning, his footsteps receding without haste. Eleanor watched him until he reached the door, and the door closed quietly behind him. She looked down at the rosemary in her basket, the cut stems already beading with cold, the grey-green leaves already closing against the chill. She was aware, in the manner of a person who has been standing on familiar ground and has felt it alter silently beneath her feet without any visible cause, that the morning she had woken into was not quite the morning she was standing in now. The library door stood open at the 7th hour of the evening, which was a thing that had not been so in all the 3 weeks Eleanor had been resident at Ashveil Park, and the light that spilled from within was not the cold blue of a winter corridor, but the warm amber of a single candle burning steadily at the centre of the long reading table, as though it had been set there with intention, or had simply been forgotten by someone who had not expected to leave. Eleanor paused in the passage, her hand resting against the doorframe, and listened to the silence of the room before she entered it. The fire had been banked low, the grate exhaling a faint, medicinal warmth that mingled with the smell of old leather and tallow and something she could not name, something that belonged to the house itself, to its particular history of closed rooms and unopened curtains, and she stood in it for a moment, as one stands inside a held breath. The chair nearest the candle was angled at a degree that suggested recent occupation, its legs not squared to the table as the other chairs were squared, but turned slightly toward the dark window, as though whoever had sat there had spent some portion of the evening looking out at a garden they could not see. On the table before it lay the large survey map that Edmund had spread open the previous week, its corners weighted with a brass inkwell and 2 volumes of natural philosophy, and beside the map, newly placed and still open to a page midway through, a small journal bound in calfskin of a faded green. The handwriting that covered the open page was not Edmund's. Eleanor could see that from the doorway. It was a finer hand, more slanted, the letters formed with a certain deliberate care that spoke of a writer who had been taught not only to write, but to be seen writing. And the ink was not fresh. It had the brown quality of words set down in some earlier year, some earlier winter, and Eleanor looked at it for the duration of 3 quiet breaths, and then she crossed the room and closed it. She used both hands. She set the spine flush with the edge of the map, with a straightness that was not tidiness but something more careful than tidiness, and then she folded her hands in front of her and looked at the candle, which burned without flickering in the still air of the room, as patient and particular as a kept vigil. She did not hear him in the doorway. She was not certain how long he had been there when she became aware of his presence, whether it had been a moment or several, for Edmund Calder moved through his own house as a man moves through familiar grief, which is to say, without sound and without announcement, as though he had long ago ceased to expect that the rooms would hold anyone other than himself. He said, without preamble and without the preparatory clearing of throat that men of his station often employed when approaching a difficult subject, her name was Clara. She died in this house. The words were not offered as an explanation for the journal, nor as an apology for the open door, nor as the beginning of a longer account. They were offered as a name is offered, as the only gift remaining when everything else has been taken, and Eleanor received them in the spirit in which they were given, which was to say, she did not speak, and she did not look away from the candle, and she did not arrange her expression into anything that might be identified as sympathy or sorrow or understanding, because all of those arrangements would have cost him something, and he had already spent a very great deal this evening. He came into the room. He sat on the far side of the table. Eleanor remained where she was, and they were separated by the width of the old oak and the small warm light of the candle between them, and neither of them spoke again for a very long time. The fire settled once in the grate with a soft collapse of ash. Somewhere in the upper story, a window shutter moved against its latch in the January wind which had risen since nightfall, and Ashveil Park held them both in the particular way that houses hold people who have nowhere else to go. Not with warmth precisely, but with a steadiness that passes for it in the long dark hours of winter. The candle burned lower. It guttered once and recovered, and then guttered again in a way that suggested it would not recover a second time, and they sat with it until it did not. The morning arrived as mornings at Ashveil Park had lately learned to do, quietly, and with a certain deliberate weight, as though the house itself held its breath before releasing it into the pale corridors. Frost had returned in the night, thin and insistent, tracing its signature across the lower window panes in the servants' hall, and it was there, beside the cold hearth, that Mrs. Pelham had not yet coaxed to warmth that the housekeeper first said the words aloud, setting them down before Lady Marin with the careful precision of a woman who understood that some news, once spoken, could not be recalled. The village was talking. That was the whole of it, and yet it was never the whole of it, and both women present in that small stone room understood the shape of what lay beneath. Eleanor Voss, companion, a woman of no particular fortune, no particular connection, had remained at Ashveil Park, beyond what anyone might call the natural terminus of her engagement, and the village, which noticed all departures and arrivals with the faithful attention of a parish register, had begun to assign its own accounting to the fact. The word that had reached Mrs. Pelham by way of the butcher's boy and the draper's wife, and the particular silence that falls over a room when someone of consequence has only just left it, was the word irregular, and it carried, as such words invariably do, an entire architecture of insinuation within its 4 neat syllables. Lady Marin received this information as she received most information of consequence, seated, without visible expression, her hands folded over the ivory head of her walking stick with the patience of someone who has outlived a great many rumours and expects to outlive a great many more. She did not ask Mrs. Pelham to repeat herself. She did not, in the hour that followed, speak of the matter to anyone save Eleanor herself, and when she did so it was in the east sitting-room before the midday light had fully committed itself, and she did not soften the words, because Lady Marin Calder had long since decided that softened words were a form of condescension, she would not offer to anyone she considered worth addressing plainly. Eleanor stood near the writing table, her hands at her sides, her face precisely as it was, unmoved, attentive, with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to receive difficult intelligence without permitting it passage to her expression. She asked, when Lady Marin had finished, whether the dowager believed it. The old woman was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted in the grate. A coal dropped and settled, and the room continued as rooms do. Lady Marin said, at last, that she believed Gerald wished Ashveil's debts to make Edmund sufficiently desperate to receive Miss Holt as a remedy, and that a companion of uncertain attachment offered a useful obstacle to that arrangement, and a more useful scandal if one were required. The observation was not made unkindly. It was made the way one might remark upon the weather, with the weariness of someone who has observed the same pattern repeat itself across too many seasons to find it interesting. Eleanor thanked her. She meant it. That evening she sat at the small secretary in her room. A piece of furniture that had once served some other purpose in some other part of the house, its surface marked with the faint impressions of previous letters in a hand not her own, and she wrote to her sister in Somerset. She described the frost on the windows. She described the particular quality of light that fell through the gallery at the hour before supper, how it lay across the floor in long, pale bars, how the house in those moments seemed almost to breathe. She did not describe Lady Marin's words, nor Gerald's rumour, nor the careful arithmetic of what might follow if the village continued to talk and Edmund continued to grieve, and she continued to remain in a house that had, in some manner she could not name precisely, begun to feel less like an assignment and more like a weight she carried willingly. She folded the letter. She sealed it with the plain red wax she kept in the top drawer. She set it on the corner of the secretary where she placed correspondence to be sent in the morning. And then she sat a while longer in the quiet of her room, listening to the frost settle into the glass, and she did not send it. The study door closed with the particular quietness of a decision already made, not slammed, not eased shut by an apologetic hand, but drawn to with the deliberate patience of a man who has weighed every consequence and found them all acceptable. Eleanor heard it from the far end of the corridor, where she had paused beneath the portrait of the third Earl, a candle in her hand, and a borrowed volume of natural philosophy tucked beneath her arm, and the sound settled into her chest, like a stone dropped into still water, sending out its rings long after the initial disturbance had ceased. She did not press closer. She was not the sort of woman who pressed closer, and whatever passed between Edmund Calder and his cousin within that cold, book-lined room was not hers to witness, however deeply its outcome might concern her. She carried her candle upstairs and read 3 pages of her borrowed volume without retaining a single sentence. The fire in her small room had burned low, and she did not ring for more coal, and the cold crept in from the window casement with the unhurried confidence of a season that knows it has many months remaining. It was Lady Marin who told her, the following morning over the narrow breakfast table in the east sitting-room where the dowager took her tea, precisely at 9. Gerald Calder had been instructed to quit Ashveil Park before the morning bell, the old woman said, without looking up from the silver pot, her voice carrying the mild neutrality of one reporting a change in the weather. Edmund had been quite clear. Gerald's carriage, a hired one, Eleanor noticed, which struck her as a detail of some significance, for it suggested that even the means of his departure had been arranged with a deliberateness designed to leave nothing unresolved, rolled over the frozen gravel drive at 6:15, the wheels grinding against the hard-packed frost with a sound that Eleanor did not hear herself, but could imagine precisely. Each stone giving a brief, cold report beneath the iron rim, the whole procession carrying the finality of a chapter closed without ceremony. She had risen early enough, had stood at her window in the grey half-light, before the household woke properly, and had seen only the long, pale drive and the silver-edged elms and the particular stillness that descends upon a house when a trouble has departed it, though the heir does not yet know quite what to do with the space. Edmund said nothing of it to her. He did not seek her out in the library, nor pause at the door of the schoolroom, where she assisted with correspondence on certain mornings, nor send any word through Lady Marin, or through the quiet, self-contained housekeeper, Mrs. Pelham, who had observed the week's events with a professional invisibility that Eleanor deeply admired. What came instead was a note, delivered by the underfootman on a small silver tray, a folded sheet of cream paper sealed with plain wax and bearing no device, which asked, in Edmund's careful, somewhat cramped hand, whether Miss Voss had yet arrived at a determination regarding the renewal of her contract of engagement. He hoped she was comfortable. He hoped the cold had not troubled her rooms. The note was signed with his full name and title, as though they had not spent an evening together in the library discussing the precise pitch of longing that certain minor poets managed more honestly than the celebrated ones. Eleanor read it twice. The second reading was not for comprehension, but for the thing she had not allowed herself to identify on the first. The restraint in it. The deliberate care of a man who had removed a threat from her path without once requiring her to acknowledge that a threat had existed, who had asked for nothing in return and had offered nothing that might oblige her to feel either gratitude or sentiment, but had simply, quietly, entirely acted. She set the note on the small table beside her inkstand and sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, and the winter light falling pale and even through the frost-edged panes. Then she rose, smoothed her dark dress with the flat of her palms, in the way she had long since learned to do when composing herself for something she could not quite name, and went to find him. The library held its breath when Eleanor crossed the threshold, as though Ashveil Park itself had been waiting since the first frost to witness what would be said within these walls. The candles had burned low in their brass sticks, their light spreading thin and amber across the spines of 1,000 unread hours, and the cold pressed itself against the tall windows with the patient insistence of something that believed it would eventually be let in. Edmund stood with his back to the room, his silhouette a dark and steady thing against the frost-rimed glass, his hands loose at his sides, his attention given entirely to whatever the winter darkness beyond chose to show him. He had not heard her enter, or perhaps he had, and had elected not to turn, granting her the small courtesy of a moment in which to compose herself before they were required to be anything to one another. Eleanor did not hurry. She had walked the corridor from her own rooms with deliberate steps, the note folded twice in her left hand, until she had left it upon her writing table, understanding that she would not need it further, that its words had already done their work and settled somewhere quieter than memory. She had read it twice, the first time quickly, the second time slowly, as one reads a thing one wishes to be certain one has understood, and then she had set it down and risen, and that rising had been its own answer. The fire on the hearth spoke in low syllables, occasional and unhurried, and a branch of holly someone had placed upon the mantel gave off the faint green scent of something still living, despite the season. Eleanor came to stand several paces behind him, close enough that her presence would be felt rather than announced, and she let the silence settle around them both, like a garment neither had thought to put on, but which suited, as it happened, very well. It was she who spoke first. She said, simply and without preface, that she had decided and that she would stay. The words left her with less difficulty than she had anticipated, carrying within them no flourish, no plea, no invitation to argument, only the plain fact of a resolution arrived at in full possession of herself, offered now with the same quietness in which it had been made. Edmund did not turn immediately. A breath passed, and then another, and she watched the line of his shoulders accept what she had said, the way cold stone accepts warmth, slowly, without ceremony, with a gratitude so restrained it might almost have been mistaken for stillness. When he did turn, it was with a deliberateness that matched her own, and the expression she found on his face was not relief. She had half expected relief, had prepared herself for it, the loosening of a man who has been uncertain, but something quieter and more considered than relief, a gratitude that had no interest in performing itself, that asked nothing of her in return and made no claim. He looked at her the way one looks at something one had feared might not come, and now, having come, is simply and entirely present. He asked, after a moment, whether she was certain. The question was not a challenge. It was offered with the same careful economy he brought to everything. A man who had learned through grief to say only what he meant and mean only what he could sustain. Eleanor said yes. She did not elaborate. She had said what there was to say, and the elaboration would have been for her own benefit rather than his, a scaffolding erected around something that required none. The yes stood between them, clean and unencumbered, and he received it without pressing further. Then he turned toward the low table beside the decanter, old crystal, the kind that has been in a house long enough to bear its own faint history of evenings, and he set 2 glasses side by side upon the silver tray with a care that was not theatrical but simply exact, the care of a man who was accustomed to being alone in this room at this hour and was adjusting, quietly, to the altered condition of the night. He poured. It was the first gesture of ordinary hospitality he had extended toward her since she had arrived at Ashveil Park, not the courtesy of an employer, not the correctness of a man aware of his obligations, but the simple human act of making room for another person at the close of a long and difficult day, and it said in the language of small things more than either of them was yet prepared to speak aloud. Eleanor accepted the glass he offered. Outside, the frost continued its slow work upon the windows, and the house breathed around them, and the fire settled lower in the grate, and the night stretched forward into whatever the morning would be asked to hold. The fire in Lady Murren's chamber had resisted all evening, sulking behind a green log that refused to give its heat. Until some time past midnight it relented at last, and a steady warmth crept across the turkey rug, and touched the edges of the old woman's counterpane with something very like tenderness. Eleanor sat on the near side of the bed, a candle guttering at her elbow, her hands folded in her lap with the patience of one who has long since learned that watchfulness requires no outward movement, only presence, quiet and continuous, offered like water poured without ceremony into a waiting vessel. The house around them had grown very still, as houses do in those hours when even the draughts seem to retire, when the clocks forget their own voices and the darkness presses gently against the window panes as though curious rather than threatening about what passes within. Lady Murren breathed in shallow measures, each exhale a small concession, and the firelight moved across her cheek with the unhurried attentiveness of something that understood It was needed here. Outside, the park lay under a sky that had cleared without announcement, and the cold of 1814, which had been a visitor of particular severity, pressed its forehead against the glass and watched with the same wordless vigil that Eleanor kept inside. She did not know precisely when the door opened. She heard only a change in the room, a subtle adjustment of warmth and shadow. And then Edmund was there, drawing the high-backed chair from beneath the window and placing it, with considered quietness, on the far side of the bed, as though the old woman sleeping between them were a compass by which both might take their bearing. He did not speak. He sat as Eleanor sat, his coat still on, his hands resting on his knees with a weight that suggested he had not considered sleep, and did not intend to. There are arrangements that require no negotiation, two people arriving at the same task, from opposite directions, finding that the work divides itself naturally and without discussion, and this was one of them. The candle burned, the fire settled. Lady Maren turned her cheek a fraction toward the warmth, and some tightness eased from her brow, as though even in sleep she recognized that the room had grown less lonely. It was perhaps an hour later, or perhaps less, time behaving with its customary indifference to human need, when Lady Maren's breathing deepened into something steadier, and Edmund leaned forward very slightly in his chair. He did not look at Eleanor directly. He spoke toward the counterpane, toward the sleeping figure between them, as a man speaks when he is not yet certain he deserves to be heard, yet finds the words will come regardless. He said that his mother had told him she had chosen Eleanor quite deliberately. He said she had used the word chosen with some emphasis, as one does when distinguishing an act of will from mere circumstance. And then he said, with the particular evenness of a man relaying something that had moved him more than he wished to show, that Lady Maren had called Eleanor the only honest person she had encountered in 10 years. The words arrived in the room and stayed there, as words do when they are true. Eleanor received them without deflection, without the modest lowering of the eyes that convention might have required, without the murmured disclaimer that would have cost nothing and meant nothing. She considered them as one considers a gift of some unexpected plainness, not beautiful in itself, but exact, and therefore better than beautiful. She said, and her voice was very quiet, that she had been glad to know her. That was all. It was sufficient. Edmund was silent for a moment, and in that silence the fire made some small adjustment, a log settling deeper into its own warmth, and the light in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, as though making room for what was about to be said. He told her he had not known how to say it. He paused in the way of a man who is not searching for the right word, but rather gathering the will to speak the word he has already found. And then, with the careful plainness of someone who understands the difference between a confession and a declaration, he said that he was glad she was here. Not grateful, not relieved. Glad, a word of the interior, a word that asks nothing and announces nothing except the quiet state of a heart that has been in some darkness and found, without expecting to, that the darkness has grown less absolute. It was not a declaration. No lady of sense would have mistaken it for one, and Eleanor was very much a lady of sense. But it was a beginning. The kind that announces itself not with ceremony but with the simple fact of its own existence, like a fire that has finally caught, throwing its first real warmth outward into a room that had been cold quite long enough. The snowdrops arrived before anyone thought to announce them, pushing through the dark earth along the kitchen garden wall in small white clusters, unremarkable and patient, as though they had always known this moment would come, and had simply waited for the ground to grow willing. 3 months had passed since that long night in Lady Marin's chamber, 3 months in which the cold had slowly relinquished its hold on Ashveil Park with the particular reluctance of old things that have grown accustomed to their own dominion, and the estate had begun in the tentative manner of a creature roused from long sleep to remember what it was to belong to the living world. The east wing shutter, which had hung at an angle since the autumn gales and knocked against the stone frame on windy mornings with a sound like a melancholy salutation, was repaired by the second week of March, its new hinge bright against the weathered wood, a small amendment that none the less altered something in the quality of the house's silhouette against the pale morning sky. Eleanor noticed these things, the snowdrops and the shutter, and the way the kitchen girls had taken to leaving a window open in the afternoons, as she had always noticed the small articulations of a household's inner life, the details that carried more truth than any formal declaration. Lady Marin sat most days in the chair beside her window, wrapped in a shawl of dove-grey wool, her recovery thorough enough for wakefulness and conversation, but not yet for the stairs. And, from that elevated vantage, she could observe the lower grounds where the grass had deepened to a colour approaching green, though it would be some weeks yet before the description felt entirely honest. It was there that she saw them walking, Edmund and Eleanor, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light fell at a low and flattering angle across the lawn, their pace neither purposeful nor idle but simply companionable, the pace of two people who have discovered that silence in another's company may be a form of conversation more intimate than words. Lady Marin watched without comment, her expression composed in that way she had when she chose to allow something to be true without requiring it to be spoken. Edmund had come to Eleanor that morning in the small sitting-room she used for correspondence, and he had asked, with the careful courtesy he employed when he meant a thing most sincerely, whether she might walk with him to the old folly at the edge of the estate, where the grounds gave way to a copse of ash trees, and the ornamental structure his grandfather had commissioned now stood half reclaimed by moss and climbing stems of ivy. It was a small invitation by any measure, a matter of a quarter-hour's walk across open ground, and yet Eleanor had understood its nature precisely, the way one understands a sentence whose meaning exceeds its construction. She had set aside her pen and said that she would be very glad to, and the gladness was genuine and uncomplicated, which was itself a kind of miracle for a woman who had spent the better portion of her adult years arranging her emotions into shapes that would not inconvenience others. The folly was smaller than she had imagined from the east window's distant view, its columns draped in lichen of a soft ochre hue, its interior open to the sky where the roof had long since surrendered to the seasons, and the floor was covered in a resilient moss that muffled their footsteps and gave the whole small space the hushed quality of a chapel or a library. Edmund did not make a speech. He had never been a man of speeches, and Eleanor would not have trusted one had he offered it. He simply took her hand, not seized it in the manner of men who act before the moment fully arrives, but took it, her fingers sliding into his with the naturalness of something long intended, and his grip was light and certain in equal measure, warm from the walk. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands and observed the fact of them with the quiet attention she gave to all things that mattered, the ink stain at the base of his thumb, the careful seam of her own glove, where she had repaired it last November, the way the afternoon light lay across their knuckles in a stripe of pale gold. Then she looked at him and he at her, and between them there passed one of those moments of recognition that require no ceremony, because they are themselves the ceremony, the thing itself, rather than the announcement of the thing. Ashveil Park stood behind them in the spring light, its shutters straight and its kitchen garden beginning to green, and Lady Marin's window was a small bright square in the east wing, and somewhere inside the house a young housemaid was laughing at something in the manner of a child entirely unafraid. Eleanor did not yet know what form the future would take, what arrangements propriety would require, or what words would eventually be spoken in what rooms. But she knew, with the particular certainty that comes not from reasoning, but from the body's own quiet testimony, that she had arrived somewhere she would not be asked to leave. The season moved around them with its ancient and unhurried indifference, and it was enough.